So I'll go ahead and introduce Phil, who's the Region 5 Fuels Planner for the Forest Service. And he has advanced the use of quantitative wildfire risk assessments to drive proactive landscape planning. His pioneering work has helped identify wildfire management zones for the Southern Sierra Nevada, and by stratifying the landscape along a continuum from aggressive community protection through restoration and then maintenance, where increasing deference is given to wildfire accomplishing its resource objectives or our resource objectives. Phil's work provides needed context for evaluating the, quote, safe and effective wildfire response, unquote, which is part of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Phil. Thanks for being here.
You bet. Glad to be here. Really, the stuff that Malcolm was talking about really tears into what we've been doing. We're really trying to really apply the concept that Malcolm was talking about and just, refine that and apply it into forest planning, forest plan revisions in the Southern Sierra, which is ongoing, and hopefully we'll come out with the draft plan and draft EIS sometime probably late spring this year. So kind of looking forward to seeing that coming out. This is just sort of the way we're looking at things, sort of this circular cycle of planning, and we really start out with a stochastic wildfire simulation model that we've been using, and we use a model called FSIM. It's a large fire simulator that we use to get to various probabilities of different flame lengths categories and burn probabilities. And then we look at what we call HVRAs, which are highly valued resources and assets. And we need to characterize those, where they are on the landscape, and then and how they are susceptible to fire, how they respond to fire at those different flame lengths, either positively or negatively. And then we get into the net value change. So we get a net value change from these HVRAs, and on a landscape scale, we get these changes, and we look at that. And then what we do, we call this the Continuum analysis, and we've nicknamed it the Justifier, which came about a long time ago, the nickname. But so we really try to, that's where we come up with these zones and try to really look at where on the landscape where you are going to be more in a protection stance versus a resource objective type stance. And then we go to and try to integrate that into spatial fire planning, which is part of the wildland fire decision support to have information there from forest plans. And then we hopefully go out and manage towards desired condition and go around the block and do some remodeling and reanalyzing to see how we're doing. So the forests that we are working on currently for forest plan revisions are what we call the early adopter national forests. So there's 3 in California, and they're the Inyo, the Sequoia, and the Sierra. So there's a few of these throughout the country that are the first ones to use the new forest planning rule out there, and so these are the ones in California. And for your information, we're using this risk framework that was published a few years ago, I think in 2013, I think, by Joe Scott, Matt Thompson, and Dave Calkin. So this is really the methodology that we're using. So if you have interest, you can look at this paper. So why would we do this, and why would we look at risk and any potential benefits? Is there's lots of policy that asks us to look at risk, and so sound risk management is foundational in lots of policies. The guidance, the wildland fire guidance policy, national cohesive strategy, and then our manuals, our Forest Service manuals, talk about assessing risk. And so this is just a way of looking at how current fire policy, the guidance for fire policy, applies managing fire on the landscape. So it's really managed on a continuum from where you have protection objectives on one side and resource objectives on the other. And those objectives are really should be determined by where you are on the landscape in regard to if fire would be more favorable to the landscape via the location, and then via the conditions, you know, environmental conditions, different kinds of conditions. So in this case, the colors on the continuum really reflect what we're in the risk assessment world would be net value change. But so having where you would be more of on a protection stance, you would be more likely to get damages to things, to either assets or resources, depending on the conditions and the location. And then the resource objectives on the other side in the blue area would be where you're really getting benefits, where you would be getting some ecological benefits. So this was just a way to kind of display how the fire management policy really is set now. There's not really any kind of one fire is bad, one fire is good. Back in the fire use day, there was, you know, you would have a fire, and if it got out of the area that you were planning to keep it in, then it would be considered a bad fire. So now it's really more situational, depending on location and condition. So one of the other reasons why we're working on this effort to define these zones is what Malcolm was talking about, because of the constraints. So really, it's kind of a heads up that if we're going to manage any of the landscape, especially on the forests we're dealing with, that you're not going to be doing it mechanically. A lot of it's going to have to be done through fire, either prescribed fire or managing wildfire to meet objectives. So, so that's just one of the overriding things that we're really focusing on these forest plan revisions, to try to change the paradigm some on how we manage fire, and try to have plan components in the forest plans that encourage the more of the use of fire. So this is another way of looking at how we're trying to deal with this, and spatially in dealing with the zones. And so you need some of these things to really come up with a good wildfire management decision. And so one of the things you need is really something that sets a strategic stage for your objectives for a fire. So we're working in the NEPA, under NEPA, doing the forest plan revisions and to create these zones. And in the past, we have gotten sued on some things where we've made some of these zones that define sort of resource management outside of NEPA, and we got in trouble and got sued on that. So we're trying to make that within the forest plan, or we are making them in the forest plan. So these are spatial, and then we're doing this risk-based informed, and they'll be in the land management plan. And then the other part is to really weigh on things is the management requirements. So those can come from laws, regulations, or land management plans. So that's still, if it's in the land management plan, that's still on the NEPA side of the world. So we need those to tie in to making a good decision to manage fire for resource objectives. And then the whole other part of the world, which is the decision support part of the world that we have with the wildland fire decision support, different kinds of things that would support a fire. And so that would be more of really looking at the conditions during the fire to give you more support to know about what the conditions are and what the likelihood of things are when the fire is happening. So you really have this context of what's your overarching strategy or objective for fire, and then the requirements, and then you have this more situational thing going on when you're actually making the decision dealing with more of the conditions that you're working under. So I wanted to just help illustrate, I have a video here, and this to illustrate the stochastic nature of our fire simulations that we have. And this is just a piece of the Sierra National Forest, a little bit of the Yosemite National Park. And this is just to give an idea of how many fire simulations that we have, and that represent very few fires in reality, but we have a really robust amount of information from these fires. So in this video, the fires are going to be color-coded with this net value change. And so these are, the red are really negative net value change. So in the context of the risk assessment, we're getting damages. The values are being damaged, so we're losing value. And then we go to neutral, and then we're getting some benefits going this way. And this is kind of typical of what's been out there when these risk assessments have been done, is that you have, when things get damaged, and probably a lot of these are assets, but they get damaged badly, these are high magnitude compared to the magnitudes of the benefits. So usually we get lower benefits, but the benefits are over a broader area on the landscape, and then we get worse outcomes, but those are usually more concentrated, especially around communities and other areas. But that's kind of how it works out. So I don't know if that's going to work. Might not work. So So anyhow, sorry about that.
It looks like something's happening behind the scenes.
Oh, is it?
I was getting it. Here we go.
I just have that only the file owner can play this media, so maybe I can't control it, and maybe you would.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe not. Oh, is something
Can
happening?
You take control back?
Yeah, I can take control back. And then what do I do?
I think you just click on the image.
Oh. Are people seeing anything?
Yeah, it's kind of yeah, it's kind of not the best quality, but you can see that there's all these different fire simulations, and there's a series of, you know, damaging fires and fires that are positive fires and different size fires. So these 4,000, a little over 4,000 fires are actually happened over 10,000 simulated seasons. So really the 4,000 simulated fires actually represent what, like 0.4 fires, you know, or annualized fires. So you have lots of modeled fires representing just a few fires or a portion of fire on the landscape. So that was sort of the point of that, to get an idea of the way the stochastic nature works. So then the zones we have are these 4 zones that we're dividing the landscape up into, informed by risk. And so we have what we call a community protection, community wildfire protection zone, the general wildfire protection zone, and then wildfire restoration and wildfire maintenance. So these are actually fire or management areas within the forest plan, so they will have plan components associated with them. And so the risk is really very high to community assets within the community protection zone. In general protection, resources are really at risk there, but there is this threat of fires moving from the general protection zone into the community protection zone. And then really the restoration zone is sort of a moderate risk to just resources. And then we have the maintenance, which is really defined by that you have a likelihood of benefits there on that one. And then we are, at least right now when the draft comes out, we're proposing that we can use wildfires to meet resource objectives in all zones, but that would be conditional, and obviously there would be very limited in the protection zones, and then as you go to the maintenance zones, it's going to be more encouraged and have plan components that try to help compel people to manage fires to meet resource objectives. So we get all this data, and it comes in just as a pixel scale, and as you see on the left, and then you need to have a way of summarizing this data to kind of make some sense out of it, to build these zones, because you can't really have zones on a pixel scale. So this goes back to what Malcolm was talking about the hydrologic units. We started at our first iterations to use those hydrological unit 6s, and we decided that that was okay, but we wanted to refine that more and put it into more of a fire management context. So we came up with this idea that we're calling pods, which I think Malcolm mentioned that it would be better, you know, served if you had some local people drawing lines on a map. And so that's essentially what we do here, is that these are potential really wildland fire operation delineations. So they're pods, and so these are really made by fire managers. So the fire managers on the forest get together and really hone in on where there are features on the landscape that would aid in managing fire. And so then the landscape gets divided up that way with these delineations that they do, and it puts this fire management operational context to the zones and summarizing the data. So what we ended up, there's some different things we did in the community protection zone and the general protection zones, but this is what the Sierra National Forest looks like for our draft strategic wildfire management zones for the forest plans. And then just kind of note that the crosshatch are wilderness areas, and that gives you an idea that a lot of the maintenance zone is up in the wilderness, but there are also some of the other zones that are within the wilderness. And this is just to get an idea sort of conceptually, if you look at the continuum, where the proportions of the forest in these zones and sort of where they would lie on the continuum. So you have these lower percentages in the general protection zones and community protection zones, and then these higher areas, higher percentages in maintenance and restoration. So just conceptually, that taking maintenance, that a larger portion of the landscape under wider ranges of conditions would meet objectives, but then you still have certain conditions that would be unfavorable to meeting those objectives. So that's sort of the concept, that you're just really taking a slice out of the continuum, but you're not defining the conditions, but you're honing in on the location. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of addressing the uncertainty for managers, and we're hoping that the zones will help decision makers to have information up front that would give them risk information that would lead to less uncertainty about the decision. And so that is our proposed zones, and then these are the current land management zones that we have, which are not based in risk, but they're based on proximity to different, to communities, basically. So they're the WUI defense and WUI threat zones. And then this is just a way of looking at how the risk is proportioned on the zones, and if they really give you information to help with dealing with uncertainty. And so because of the proximity, these do capture a certain amount of the total risk and benefit on the landscape, but it's just a proximity type way of looking at things. And so you end up with a certain proportion. You still have a higher proportion in the damage side of the equation. But then when you get to this other, the rest of the forest, you really sort of have a fair amount of uncertainty of what your outcomes are potentially going to be. You know, you sort of have this mixed bag of 45% of all the damage happens there, and then 68% of the good, but it's not proportioned very well as far as one side or the other. So, and this is for risk location, this is where the net value change is happening. We'll talk about source in a minute, but so then the zones we have, they're proportioned differently, but because they're based in risk, that this has a lot of assets and also has some benefit within it, but the proportions are more leaning towards damage. And then as you go down to maintenance, you end up being with not very much damage to potential damage to resources, but a fair amount of positive benefits to resources. And then as you move on to what we call risk source, this is fires that start in these zones, what their outcomes are. So where the change is happening. So it tends to be different, but in other, let's just look at other, you tend to have this mixed bag still. And then on WUI threat, you have a fair amount of mixed bag also. And for us, on the newer proposed plan, is that it turns out that there's actually a fair amount of fires that cause some good that start in the community protection zone, actually a fair amount, but there's kind of this overwhelming part of damages and a fair amount of assets. And then in the general protection zone, you start having assets affected by fires that start in here. And then it kind of goes that way. But the proportions are still leaning towards positive. But one of the take-home things, I think, is that there's potential for fires from these zones, you know, starting in these zones probably to go into the other zones and cause some good. So I think that's really a reason to really work on making communities more resilient to fire. Okay. Going along. Okay, so this I'm going to show a video just to demonstrate that we looked at trying to see over a season how fire, lightning fires, so we did a lightning fire simulation, that what would be the net value change for those over the course of a season within these pods. And so kind of like the other video, they'll change color over the season, and you should get an idea how that might work. And we'll see if this actually works. I might just have to click through it. So there's March. April, early April, late April, May. Then you're getting into May later, and so you're getting more benefit up there, higher percentage of benefit from the average benefit from fire starting in those pods. And then June, and then July, August, September, November, so I think that's the end there. So this is just one of the tools using some of the data that we would hope would get to more of sort of the conditions or the seasonality of where there might be opportunities within these pods to have a higher likelihood of managing for resource objectives. So I think that's it. We're just really trying to work to apply what Malcolm helped us start, for sure.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. I'm sure everyone on the call is really impressed with this closely quantified approach, thinking about risk to zone out the landscape and then analyze how effectively those zones work. I wanted to just raise one question that was brought in on the chat session. This was about how the pods were developed, and wondering if that was restricted to the Forest Service fire planners or whether it engaged the communities and the work in, say, community wildfire protection plans.
Right at this point, it was just internal, and the pods were really just something to do as a summary unit. As far as in the forest plans, they aren't going to be anything within the forest plan, so I would see those being able to be adjusted and, you know, doing something different. But we really wanted to try to have some opportunity to have those pods or those features that were identified to be more of potential zone boundaries, that it would just put the risk in more of a fire management context, and then it might lead to more of a prioritization of some of those features being, you know, something that would be a fuel treatment or something that you would try to anchor off of, especially those areas that would divide between a protection, one of the protection zones and one of the more resource-oriented zones, either restoration or maintenance.
Yeah, shifting threshold of opportunity or challenge. Well, Phil, thank you very much. We're going to bring this part of our call to a close and shift over to more of our business discussion. And I don't imagine, Phil or Malcolm, that you care to be a part of this, but you're welcome to hang around. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We will have the recording of the presentation available online.